the clerks there, they treated you like that. I mean, they would continue their conversations. They weren't the least bit interested in showing you anything. I mean, if you asked to see something in the display case, they would finish their conversation first before answering your request. And it was though you were intruding upon their private time. They were willing. Do you want me to continue, or do you want to move on to something else?
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the things Chuck mentioned, driving in, we arrived in September, I think it was September of '81. And as we came in the evening from the airport, and the streets were, these street lights there on Chang'an, the main drag there in Beijing, it was like a blackout. The street lights were so dim, and this I'd noted before when I'd been there in March. That gradually changed over time, so that you had brighter street lights. But there were very few cars on the road, I think, as Takashi had mentioned. Very few. And of course, they always drove their lights on. Bicycles were the way most people got around, and it was what my husband and I very much enjoyed doing on Sundays, when we let the resident staff go, and if the cook would make us some Chinese dumplings, jiaozi, why he would leave them in the upstairs. The residence was a very adequate building, and the lower level was for what we call representational purposes, when you were entertaining receptions, large dinner parties, that sort of thing. But we had our own private apartment just upstairs, and so it was wonderful to be just by ourselves on Sundays. We'd go out on our bikes for a couple of hours and then come back. And that way, I mean, I'm sure they knew exactly who we were and where we were going, and we were being followed in some way, but it wasn't obtrusive. And they knew that my husband spoke Chinese and understood Chinese. They knew his whole background, and that he had been interned during the war by the Japanese, had escaped over the wall, and he and an Englishman had joined, well, they were willing to, whoever would pick them up, be they communists or be they nationalists, they couldn't care less. And it turned out that they were nationalists who picked them up. And then they were able to make contact with Chongqing. When we arrived for our tour of duty in Taiwan some years later, why, there was the leader of this nationalist guerrilla group meeting us at the airport. The Chinese in Beijing, when we go to Beijing, they are aware of all of this. But, when they gave agrément, as I say, they knew what they were getting pretty much. And in some ways, I think they knew that he had been born in China, that he spoke Chinese quite well. He perhaps had spoken it better when he was with the guerrillas, but his accent was very good. And I know Chinese have said that, if I shut my eyes, I would think I was speaking to a Chinese. His tones were correct. He'd learned it, he'd heard it as a child. And this, when you're learning a language, you hear it, you mimic, but you hear. And that's what he had done. When he was with people from Shanxi province, as several people were, the wife of Huang Zheng and Zhu Qizheng both came from Shanxi province around Fengzhou. That's a pretty strong accent. But the three of them could converse, and it's nothing that I could possibly understand. But talking about your different regional, okay, lighting improves. I started Chinese lessons for the third time. We'd served in Hong Kong, we served in Taipei, and then later in Beijing. And each time I began with basic Chinese. The tutor came to the house 2 or 3 times a day, and he had been selected by the Waiban, the Foreign Affairs Bureau. And it was along about '83, one day he said to me, feel free to ask me any questions that you want. We'd never said this before. we always discussed the lesson, and questions would be pertaining to the lesson. And so I thought, well, either they want to hear what I'm thinking and what kind of questions I'm going to ask, or there is this opening and they feel more comfortable being asked questions. I was never quite sure. Not that my questions changed very much. I mean, I was just curious to know anything and everything that I could. I did not ask provocative questions. My experience over the years is that I didn't gain very much except an adverse reaction to ask a provocative question. You can work around that and probably find another way of getting what information you might like, and that's the tone of voice that you use in asking such a question.
Daddy, did you feel over the years that these women who you got to know there, that they opened up more and more, or that you learned different things about them from what you learned at the time?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. And we meet comfortably. And I hear from them at different times. Two of the husbands have died now. But no, we're on a first name basis and just very comfortable with each other. We're talking about the pace of change. One of these women, she was the director of the School of Graphic Design. It was parallel, it was not far from the Jeanne Badeau. And she had, her father had been one of the scholars working on Dunhuang, and she had spent time in France. Some of her early education had been in France. She comes back, and she, by the time I met her, she was the director of the School of Graphic Design. One of the last times when I was out there, and she and her driver in the car were bringing me back to the Jungle Hotel where I was staying. And as we're driving down the main drag, which is Chang'an, which those of you who've been in Beijing, you know what it is. And of course, the face of Chang'an had changed considerably. Here are all of these high-rise monumental buildings there along Chang'an. And she turned to me and she said, "What do you think of this?" And I turned to her and said, "Chantano, what do you think of it?" And she said, "I think it's too much, too fast." That was her response. Now, mind you, she is my generation. Well, I'd say she's probably 10 years younger than I am. But that was her reaction at that point. The one other point, let's I liked what Dan said yesterday, and he didn't use the word. And thank you. But when he was talking about, really he was talking about one's sensitivity, I think, in a foreign culture. And certainly Dan has that, and I think, well, I'm sure this is one of the reasons he's so well received and will continue to be. And I felt this way about my husband. I mean, he should be the one who is here speaking to you, that he would speak from much greater depth and more knowledgeably. But I think that the Chinese are aware of this. There are times, given the political situation, when they can seem distant and unfriendly. But my feeling was we were not to take this personally. It was directed toward our policy and not toward us as individuals. And because maybe 6 months later, we're together and everything is, the policies are congenial, shall we say, and then everything is back on track again. All right, I think I've talked enough. Thank you.